How does a man who spent decades at the top of Hollywood, charming the world with that signature grin and effortless charisma, end up quietly battling some of the darkest moments of his life, far away from the flashing lights? George Clooney, once hailed as Hollywood's most eligible bachelor and the poster child for suave sophistication, seemed untouchable. He was the guy every man wanted to be and every woman wanted to marry. But behind the perfectly tailored suits and silver hair was a man carrying pain that money, fame, and love could never completely heal. This is not just the story of George Clooney, the actor. This is the story of George Clooney, the man. The one who has faced career failures, chronic physical agony, crushing loneliness, and questions about his life that no Oscar can answer. George Clooney wasn't born into stardom, he was born into expectation. Raised in Augusta, Kentucky, in a modest middle-class household, George was the son of TV journalist Nick Clooney and beauty queen Nina Bruce. While many assume his path into entertainment was paved by family connections, the truth is less glamorous. His father's regional fame came with pressure, not privilege. George wasn't handed opportunities, he inherited the weight of living up to a name. But even as a kid, he didn't quite fit the mold. In 7th grade, Clooney developed Bell's palsy, a temporary condition that paralyzed half of his face. For a year, he became the punchline in his own life, mocked by classmates and forced to confront humiliation far earlier than most children should. He later described it as a cruel teacher, one that stripped him of arrogance and taught him empathy. In his teens, Clooney was more into sports than scripts. He was a promising baseball player and even tried out for the Cincinnati Reds. He didn't make the team, and that quiet rejection, one that never made headlines, was a defining moment. It was the first time life told him no in a language he couldn't argue with. After high school, he bounced between jobs and colleges, Northern Kentucky University, then the University of Cincinnati, but never earned a degree. Instead, he took odd jobs, cutting tobacco, selling women's shoes, even working construction. These weren't just side gigs, they were survival. Clooney was drifting, unsure of what he wanted, but slowly learning what he didn't want: a life without purpose. His real break came not in LA, but in the back seat of a beat-up car. In 1982, his cousin, Miguel Ferrer, offered him a ride to California. No grand plan, just a drive, a suitcase, and a shot in the dark. He arrived with no money, no agent, and no idea how unforgiving Hollywood could be. He stayed in Ferrer's apartment, slept on the floor, and started going to auditions with no credits, no union membership, and no connections that mattered. This part of Clooney's story rarely gets mentioned, because it doesn't fit the glamorous narrative. But it's here, in the obscurity, the struggle, and the silence, that the foundations of the man were built. It took George Clooney nearly a decade of rejection before he saw the faintest glimmer of Hollywood's success. His early career was filled with bit parts, forgettable roles in sitcoms, a few commercial appearances, and pilots that were canceled before they ever aired. Behind the camera-ready smile was a man who auditioned constantly and lost out just as often. At one point, he appeared in 13 failed TV pilots. 13. But persistence paid off. In 1994, everything changed with a single role: Dr. Doug Ross on ER. Within weeks of the show's premiere, Clooney went from an almost was to an overnight sensation. He wasn't just the handsome doctor, he became a cultural icon. Women adored him. Men respected him. Casting directors finally took his calls. ER launched him into a different universe, one filled with magazine covers, red carpets, and studio offers. But fame doesn't just elevate. It complicates. Behind the scenes, Clooney found himself overwhelmed by the machinery of Hollywood's success. He was constantly working, flying between sets, interviews, and events, rarely getting a moment to breathe. His schedule was a blur, and his personal life began to fade into the background. Every decision became calculated, every smile rehearsed. He once admitted that the world started treating him differently before he even felt like he'd changed. The transition to film came fast. Roles in From Dusk Till Dawn, One Fine Day, and Out of Sight pushed him into leading man territory. And while audiences saw a charming, confident star ascending the A-list, Clooney himself was battling imposter syndrome, quietly questioning whether he belonged in that world at all. And then came a mistake that would haunt him for years. Batman and Robin. The 1997 superhero film was meant to cement Clooney's movie star status. Instead, it became one of the most critically panned blockbusters of its era. The backlash was swift and brutal. For a time, it looked like his movie career might stall before it truly began. Clooney didn't dodge the blame, he owned it, often joking that he killed the franchise. But behind the humor was real fear. He worried the industry would stop taking him seriously. So, he recalibrated. Instead of chasing blockbusters, Clooney became strategic. He worked with respected directors, took on riskier roles, and slowly earned the industry's respect, not just as a star, but as a serious actor and, eventually, a filmmaker. Films like Three Kings, Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, and The Perfect Storm showcased his range. Then came Syriana, which would win him an Oscar, but at a brutal cost, both physically and emotionally. Just as his career reached a new high, Clooney's body began to break down. But that comes next. To the outside world, George Clooney was living the dream. A-list status, international fame, box office hits, magazine covers labeling him sexiest man alive, twice. But underneath the smooth exterior, Clooney was navigating a very different reality. One marked not by romance and glamour, but by detachment, solitude, and deep emotional distance. After the collapse of his first marriage to actress Talia Balsam in 1993, Clooney made a firm decision. He would never marry again. He wasn't bitter. He was convinced. In interview after interview, he repeated the same line. No wife, no kids, no traditional family. He claimed he was content, but the people closest to him weren't so sure. His dating history read like a tabloid's greatest hits. Models, cocktail waitresses, actresses. All beautiful, all high-profile, none long-term. To the public, he was Hollywood's most eligible bachelor. But behind the charm was a man who kept one hand on the door at all times, never fully stepping into intimacy, never fully letting anyone in. Friends said George had a switch, a way of going emotionally blank when things got too close. It wasn't cruelty, it was armor. A method of control in a life where very little felt grounded. The fame machine demanded constant performance. So Clooney gave the world what it wanted. Wit, elegance, a drink in hand, and just enough mystery to keep everyone guessing. But the cracks began to show. In his 40s, Clooney started speaking more candidly about aging, about regret, about loneliness in hotel rooms after the premieres were over. He joked often about being the last one at the party, but his laughter always landed a second too late. He admitted he missed having real connection, real stillness. But he had built a life where both were nearly impossible to find. Then came the Syriana accident in 2005. A spinal injury that left him with chronic pain so severe he couldn't stand upright without agony. It forced him into weeks of isolation. He later confessed that the pain was so consuming, he considered taking his own life. Not because he wanted to die, but because he couldn't imagine surviving that level of suffering indefinitely. This was the turning point. Not just physically, but emotionally. When you're stuck in a room with your own thoughts, unable to escape into work or appearances, the truth starts to speak louder. And for George Clooney, the truth was simple. He was exhausted, from the act, from the chase, from the image that everyone adored, but few ever understood. He had all the trappings of success, yet still found himself asking, is this it? Is this all there is? And that question would soon lead him to someone who would change everything. In 2013, George met someone who didn't care about his fame, Amal Alamuddin, an international human rights lawyer who had built a powerful career in her own right. She wasn't impressed by the red carpets or celebrity parties. She was fighting cases at the International Criminal Court. She challenged dictators, not directors. And that's what changed everything for George. They married in 2014 in Venice. It was a fairy tale wedding, but behind it was something real. A connection George had never experienced before. For the first time, he saw life outside of Hollywood, a purpose bigger than the next movie. They had twins in 2017. George, now in his 50s, was changing diapers, juggling fatherhood, and learning what it meant to truly show up for someone other than himself. But life didn't suddenly become easy. The couple faced immense pressure, balancing Amal's high-profile legal work, George's ongoing career, and the demands of parenting under a microscope. They've dealt with security threats, relentless paparazzi, and the challenge of raising kids in a world obsessed with their every move. Still, friends say they've remained grounded, private, loyal. But even the strongest couples carry invisible scars. And George, he still battles pain, both physical and emotional. At 64, George Clooney is no longer chasing fame. He's producing more than acting, focusing on causes that matter to him, like democracy in Sudan and global press freedom. He speaks often about legacy now, about what he's leaving behind, not just for his children, but for the world. He's not as visible on screen, but when he does appear, there's a weight behind his eyes. A kind of wisdom that only comes from surviving storms no one else sees. The tragedy of George Clooney isn't some dramatic downfall or tabloid scandal. It's quieter than that. It's the tragedy of a man who was worshipped by the world, but spent decades trying to figure out who he really was when the cameras weren't rolling. A man who seemed to have everything, until he realized that everything meant nothing if he didn't have someone to share it with. George Clooney isn't just a Hollywood icon. He's a reminder that even the brightest stars carry shadows. That no amount of success can protect us from loneliness, pain, or regret. But maybe, in the end, his story is less about tragedy and more about redemption. If you found this story powerful, let us know in the comments. Tap the like button, hit subscribe for more real stories behind the world's most celebrated faces, and don't forget to check out the next video. We promise it's just as revealing. And remember, there's always more to the story than what we see on screen.